Good afternoon. My name is Russ Feingold, and I am president of the American Constitution Society, the country's foremost progressive legal organization with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. ACS is celebrating its 20th year of celebrating and shaping legal debate, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. Now, in this year, we are focusing our work in this anniversary on our Constitution's founding failures when it comes to race and equality in this country. And like all things that matter in the lives of Americans, the courts have a tremendous impact with a now deeply conservative federal bench. And as we face the growing proliferation of state laws that restrict access to the ballot box and seek to roll back reproductive rights, calls for reforming both the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts have grown in number and volume. Many of the reform proposals are promising, and we at ACS want to make sure we lift those up and have them thoroughly considered. We know that something has to be done, and something has to be done soon. But what is possible in the current political climate? We are grateful to have our esteemed panelists with us today to share their insights on this question. If you don't already, we encourage you to follow ACS on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. You can also find us online at acslaw.org. There you can join ACS and find more information about upcoming events and opportunities. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jen Mondaire. Jen is a senior politics reporter for HuffPost, where she has focused, among other things, in the courts and judicial nominations. She has covered Congress and the White House since April 2011, previously reporting for Roll Call and on the Texas legislature for Gallery Watch in Austin, Texas. Please welcome Jen.
Thanks, Russ. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's ACS panel on what's next for court reform. I'm Jen Mondaire. I'm a senior politics reporter for HuffPost. I cover the courts and judicial nominations, so I'll be your moderator today. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. Today's call is being recorded, and the recording will be available after the call on ACS's website. If you want to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during this call. Please don't use the chat function to submit questions because they might get missed. Feel free to send any questions during the panel. I will try to pick up some as we go, and then I will save the rest for the end. Finally, whatever this means, I'm going to tell you, 1 hour of California CLE credit is available for this call. Please email info@acslaw.org with court reform in the subject line to receive your CLE credit. If you are seeking credit in a jurisdiction other than California, please consult the rules of that state's CLE board to see if it provides for reciprocity with California. I have no idea what this means. I'm just going to read it for you guys. CLE materials can be found on the event page of ACS's website and will be shared with all participants in a follow-up email. Okay, let's move on to our panelists. Congressman Mondaire Jones is a freshman Democrat from New York. He represents all of Rockland County and parts of Central and Northern Westchester County. He went to Stanford and then worked in the Department of Justice Office of Legal Policy, where he vetted candidates for federal judgeships. And he worked to reform our criminal legal system to make it more fair and equitable. Then he went to another fancy school, Harvard Law, and worked as a litigator in private practice. He won an award by the Legal Aid Society of New York for his pro bono service investigating claims of employment discrimination. He's currently a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and he is the freshman representative to leadership in this Congress, making him the youngest member of the Democratic House leadership team. Next is Chris Kang. He is the co-founder and chief counsel of Demand Justice, a progressive judicial advocacy group. He served in the White House for nearly 7 years as deputy counsel to President Obama and special assistant to the president for legislative affairs. Chris oversaw the selection, vetting, and confirmation of more than 220 of Obama's judicial nominees, who set records for the most people of color, women, and openly gay and lesbian judges appointed by a president. He also helped spearhead the confirmations of Supreme Court Justices Sotomayor and Kagan. Chris was previously national director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and he worked for Senate Democratic Whip Dick Durbin as Director of Floor Operations and Judiciary Committee Counsel. Chris serves on the Board of Advisors for the ACS and for People's Parity Project. Next up is Lea Littman. She is an assistant law professor at the University of Michigan School of Law, where she teaches and writes on constitutional law, federal post-conviction review, and federal sentencing. She is one of the co-hosts and creators of Strict Scrutiny, a podcast about the US Supreme Court, and her writing for popular audiences has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and lots of other impressive publications. Lea graduated summa cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School, and after law school, clerked for Judge Jeffrey Sutton of the US Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and for Justice Anthony Kennedy of the US Supreme Court. Lea maintains an active pro bono practice, and she serves on the board of academic advisors of the American Constitution Society. Finally, we have Nancy Zirkin. She is a strategic consultant and was the executive vice president for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights from 2002 to 2017. Nancy was a part of its various lobbying efforts, including task forces on education reform, hate crimes, affirmative action, and judicial nominations since the 1990s. During the mid-70s, Zirkin worked at several public interest groups, including Common Cause and Women's Equity Action League, and was the director of public policy and government relations at the American Association of University Women. She was AAUW's chief lobbyist and managed coordination of the Equal Rights Amendment, Women's Vote Project, and Civil Rights Act of 1991. Let's all give our panelists an awkward round of applause from our computer screens. Okay, let's get to this. The primary questions facing this panel are, what is next for court reform? What is possible to do? And how can progressives affect change on this front? Whether it's with a push for adding more seats to the Supreme Court, setting term limits for Supreme Court justices, or adding seats to various lower courts. So Congressman Jones, I'm going to start with you. There is some talk about you introducing a bill in the House that would add seats to the Supreme Court and set term limits for Supreme Court justices. Can you talk at all about what's going on with this bill, if it's done, any idea when it might be introduced, any details at all?
Well, I so appreciate the question, and I'm grateful to be here alongside virtually so many incredible people who I have long admired, talking about an issue of the utmost importance, and that is saving our democracy through expanding the United States Supreme Court. And I do think about this from the standpoint of our democracy, which is this baseline standard that I think we all used to take for granted until recent years. And due to the right-wing takeover of the United States Supreme Court, we have seen our democracy under siege. We've seen it with Citizens United. We've seen it with the Shelby decision in 2013, which gutted the crown jewel of the Voting Rights Act, which we are now working in earnest to revive through what will, I hope, pass as the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And that I believe if we had not had that 2013 decision, we would not have seen SB 202 in Georgia become law, because it would have been stopped in its tracks under a preclearance provision. This is a right-wing takeover that is and has been anti-democratic, right? We know that the vast majority of the recent presidential elections have resulted in the popular vote going to Democratic presidential candidates. We know that Democratic senators represent 40 million more people than Republican senators, and yet we've seen this right-wing takeover of the Supreme Court, and folks like myself and many advocates across this country want to do something about that. We want to save democracy itself from a Supreme Court majority that is hostile to democracy itself. And while I won't commit to a specific deadline by which legislation will be introduced, it is an ongoing conversation with myself and my colleagues.
And do you have you been able to find any Republicans who are even vaguely interested in doing something like this, even in just conversations? Or is this truly purely a Democratic pushed effort to make changes to the court?
It is a pro-democracy effort to make changes to the Supreme Court in the same way that changes have been made at least 7 times prior to this point and in an environment where, despite 77% of the American public supporting the American Rescue Plan and not a single Republican member of the House or the Senate voting for something as popular as that, the same, of course, with H.R. 1, now Senate 1 in that chamber, I don't expect Republicans to do the right thing, to work to save our democracy, because I think they understand quite clearly that when we have a democracy, when people who are eligible to vote are able to exercise that right to vote, that they are put out of business nationally when it comes to elections.
So can you talk a little bit about why you decided as a freshman to make Supreme Court reforms your priority? That's not typically something you see with a freshman coming to Congress, making the Supreme Court like at least one of their top priority issues.
This is personal for me. I'm someone who's part of a community, and the example I'll use, the LGBTQ plus community, that waits every June to see whether we will have rights taken away from us or rights granted to us that we should have had from the beginning. Of course, I'm also an African American in this country whose voting rights are increasingly under assault by a minority of people who have, through anti-democratic efforts, outsized influence and control over our government. And so, to also add to what you asked earlier, when we think about the timing of this, it's the first time in approximately 10 years that there is unified control of government by a party that wants people to be able to exercise the right to vote. And so the urgency is clear. And that is precisely why I've shown leadership on this.
So you do plan to introduce a bill related to this. You just don't have any of the details available yet. Is that right?
There will be a bill that will be introduced, is my prediction. And I'm very excited for that to occur in the near future.
Okay. And something that you've argued for, and I know that Chris Kang with Demand Justice, I know that you guys have pushed for this too. You've argued for adding 4 seats to the Supreme Court. Why 4?
Well, 4 seats added to the Supreme Court is required to have a majority of justices who are committed to protecting our democracy. It is just a fact that the court is even more hostile to democracy than it was when it gutted the Voting Rights Act in the 2013 Shelby v. Holder decision. And so this is not a partisan power grab in the way that Mitch McConnell and a few others have described it. In fact, it is an effort to get us back to that baseline standard that I described earlier of people being allowed to exercise their constitutional right to vote. And of course, if you were to ask the average American, they would tell you that, yeah, of course, we want all LGBTQ people to be treated equally under the law. We want women to be able to make healthcare decisions without the right to do so being infringed upon. We want folks to be able to vote safely in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic, and so on and so forth. But we have 6 people now on the Supreme Court who are hostile to that and who are working and have been working in earnest to undermine those rights and the foundation of our society.
Chris,
I was just going to add, I think it's also worth remembering that, as Representative Jones said, Congress has changed the size of the Supreme Court 7 times before. And the last 5 times Congress changed the size of the Supreme Court, it did so when it added seats, it did so to make sure the number of seats matched the number of circuits in the country. Now, certainly Supreme Court justices don't ride the circuits the way they used to, but there are in fact 13 circuits right now. And so there's a historical parallel and a reason why 13 also makes good sense right now.
So, okay, Chris, so why do you think right now is the time to be pushing for reforms like this? And also, can you tell me if Demand Justice is pushing for anything different than Congressman Jones is pushing for? Or are you guys echoing each other on this?
I think first and foremost, we're in lockstep with Congressman Jones and calling for 4 seats to be added to the Supreme Court. I think that is fundamentally the first and necessary Supreme Court reform that has to happen. In addition to that, we think that There should be a binding code of ethics for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's the only court in the entire country that doesn't have one. And we do think the term limits for Supreme Court justices should be something that should be seriously considered to help depoliticize the process. But first and foremost, we think we need to add seats to restore balance to a court that has become so out of touch and so tilted toward these partisan corporate interests. And so the reason to do this now is we have this opportunity where Democrats control the House, the Senate, the White House. You know, as Senator Schumer has said in a broader context, this is an opportunity, you know, maybe twice in a century where we can really have big fundamental change in our country. And so that's why we really have to have this fight now, and we have to start pushing right away.
Okay, so this question is for you, Chris, and also for you, Congressman Jones. Let's talk a little bit about the realities of this Congress. You've got at least 2 Democratic senators already insisting they won't make any changes to the filibuster. And without changes to the filibuster in the Senate, you can't pass legislation to make these kinds of reforms. So where do you go from there when that's kind of the baseline of this otherwise Democrat-run government?
Well, it was just a few days ago that Senator Manchin was talking about a talking filibuster, which does represent a reform to that Jim Crow relic. And I remain optimistic in the way that I've been optimistic since we took back the United States Senate, that people like Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema, who I would add is also a member of the LGBTQ community and a history maker in our own right, don't want to be the senators who stand in the way of voting rights or the Equality Act, which would finally enshrine protections for that community in our federal anti-discrimination law. And so many other things that we just take for granted or had taken for granted, and in some cases are still fighting for, unfortunately, in a civilized society. And I also understand that when people run for office, they strongly prefer to be in the majority. And we will not have a Democratic majority if we don't pass Senate Bill 1, which is the Senate counterpart to HR 1, the For the People Act. We have a Republican Party that is increasingly unhinged when it comes to what it will do to stay in power. They have outsized control over the number of state governments that will allow them to really draw the maps in many places throughout this country and continue to draw districts that will elect people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and other fringe members of that party, such that they will continue to win this civil war that is happening within the Republican caucus. You know, I think about the fact that 2/3 of my House Republican colleagues voted to overturn the presidential election just hours after nearly dying alongside me earlier that day at that violent insurrection at the Capitol. And if we had independent redistricting commissions, we would get better people in Congress, including people like the folks who voted to overturn that election.
I'll just also add, look, I'm not naive about the political reality here, but I also think it's a mistake to start with what you think is currently politically possible in this moment and work backwards, right? As advocates, and I think fundamentally all of us are advocates. I just sort of happen to do this full time, but as advocates who study an issue, you look at a problem, you see this Supreme Court that's so out of balance, that's losing its legitimacy. More and more Americans think the Supreme Court bases its decision on politics rather than a law. You see a problem and then you have to find the solution, right? The solution shouldn't be cabined off by what you think is politically possible in this moment. You have to think, what is the solution that's necessary to fix this problem? And that solution is legislation to add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. So we have to start somewhere. I remember being so excited when Congressman Jones, as then a candidate about a year ago, wrote a piece in Slate talking about why we need to expand the Supreme Court for democracy reform. Now he's committing to taking the next step and actually introducing that legislation. Then all of us are going to have to work. We're going to have to push. We're going to have to call our congressmen. We're going to have to call our senators, get enough co-sponsors on the bill to get it through. And after we get it through the House, we can talk about the Senate. We can talk about whether or not we have the votes. But if we start with the premise that, you know, we can only start with what Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, or at this moment in time, 10 Republican senators will agree to, then we're never going to achieve the change that's really necessary to save our democracy. So I think that we have to be realistic about the work that has to be done, but we have to start with the steps that we're taking. And I really am so glad to have somebody like Congressman Jones leading this fight.
Let me say, first of all, Thank you very much, Congressman Jones. It is a very important bill. You and Mr. Nadler and Mr. Johnson are going to be introducing soon, and it makes a lot of sense. But as we all know, it's an uphill battle. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight it, but it does mean that without eliminating the filibuster, we can't succeed. And we can't succeed in voting, in climate change, in guns, and many other issues. What has to happen, particularly on judicial nominations, is to build a greater grassroots network in support of this, so that progressives across the country understand what's at stake and why it's important. And we can try now, but we have to look at ethics reform that I think Chris mentioned, and we have to also look at the lower courts. I will stop there, but we also have the imperative of the nominations and making sure that Trump's 234 don't stand by themselves. And President Biden's on his way. He has nominated a diverse slate, not as diverse as some of us might like, but diverse in background and experience and race and ethnicity. So we have to build this movement in order to make it happen.
If I could just pick up on something that all of the panelists have said. So Congressman Jones mentioned the importance of independent districting commissions, in order to ensure that politicians aren't picking their voters and voters are instead protecting or picking their politicians. And also to prevent these districts from electing fringe candidates when they're totally safe, districts. That's really important to the health of our democracy. It's also true that independent districting commissions face a threat from the US Supreme Court. It was by a bare majority several years ago that an opinion written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg upheld Congress's authority, or state's authority rather, to create independent districting commissions. Professor Noah Feldman at Harvard, wrote a recent op-ed in Bloomberg saying that HR 1 or Senate Bill 1, including its creation of independent districting commissions, could very well likely be invalidated by the current Supreme Court that has been very skeptical of Congress's efforts to increase the franchise, protect voting rights, and expand voting rights. So if you care about making our elections more democratic, if you care about making our country more democratic, which I really think is the first and foremost concern that we should be focusing on, that has to include some consideration about what you're going to do about the courts. Again, given the likelihood that this court could invalidate many congressional efforts to protect voting rights.
Professor, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it was just a few months ago, shortly after I had been elected to Congress in the general, that I made a call to someone who would be leading on HR 1, and I said, look, there's this Arizona case about commissions from a few years ago that gives me great pause with respect to what the Supreme Court will do. How can we limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in HR 1? And that is precisely what my office worked to do. And I'm proud of what we were able to get in there in terms of language, but it is no substitute for getting a majority on the Supreme Court that actually cares about preserving our democracy.
So one of the questions that's come in asks, any comments on Justice Breyer's recent Scalia lecture at Harvard Law, where he expressed some hesitation to expansion of the court? And I have his remarks handy. He said, people who are interested in expanding the Supreme Court to dilute the power of its conservative majority need to, quote unquote, think long and hard about the risks of doing this. He said, the risk of doing this is that it makes justices appear more political, which would erode public confidence in the court. Does he have a point?
I was very surprised, to tell you the truth, that he weighed in on something as political as the court. the fact of the matter is, his statements and statements of others show us just how much work we have to do in convincing the American people of the inequities. And the inequities are shown in what Congressman Jones talked about. Democrats represent 40 million more people. Chris talked about the imperative that was found years ago of evening the courts with the circuit court. So I was surprised by it. I was surprised by his lack of evidently knowledge of history. So yes, I'm very surprised.
Did any of the other panelists think that he had a point there, or do you feel like he's missing the point of this?
No, it was a terrible point, and it was not rooted in anyone's experience over the past several decades. And I looked around as I did a double take, because similarly to Nancy, I didn't understand why he was weighing in on the prerogative of the legislature as a member of the article of the third branch of government. So I wish he would just stop talking about that and stick to actually adjudicating cases.
I mean, on the other hand, like, I don't know what else he would say, right? Like, he's got to go back into conference. He's got to be hearing these cases. I understand that he's going to say what he has to say, but I also think that even he knows better, right? There's no question that this court already is so hyper politicized after watching, Mitch McConnell steal one seat from Barack Obama, pushing through Brett Kavanaugh with the sham investigation and the credible sexual assault allegations, and then moving through Justice Barrett just less than a week before election day. 60 million votes have already been cast. That is what has over politicized our court. That is why people are losing confidence in our court and thinking that it makes rulings based on politics rather than law, because of what Republicans have done, not because of the conversation we're having about restoring balance and legitimacy. So I think he knows better. He's seen Citizens United, Shelby County, partisan gerrymandering, purging voter rolls. He's seen it all. And I think he just sort of says what he thinks he needs to say. Hopefully this is the precursor to the announcement I think we're all hoping that Stephen Breyer will make here. And if that happens, then whatever he said last night is fine with me.
Yikes. Okay.
I would just add to that, a few things. I think Justice Breyer has to wake up every day and go to work at the court. And if he was truly convinced that this court were like irredeemable and there was no chance of getting his colleagues' votes, it would be really hard for him to go to work. And so if that's what he needs to tell himself, right, that's fine. If it's true, however, that the public actually believes the current court is apolitical and represents everyone's interests equally, then it represents a real failure of progressive organizers and media to accurately convey what this court is doing and what is happening. So if that's the challenge he is inviting, right, then we should be up to the challenge. And then finally, I think there's also a way you can read his remarks as, in some ways, an invitation to his conservative colleagues to not do all of the crazy things that many of us think are bound to happen. So he's saying, don't be the conservative court that some people are warning about and expecting you to be, and that's why they are considering expanding the court.
So Lea, I want to ask you a question. You've written about the importance of adding seats to the lower courts, which are not as sexy as the Supreme Court and often don't get as much attention, but are hugely important. The Judicial Conference just recommended last month that we create 79 more permanent judges all across the country. The last time Congress passed a comprehensive bill to expand the number of seats on district and appeals courts was 1990. And I've already seen smatterings of Republicans and Democrats in Congress who support doing something here. So I'm curious if is this where you think progressives' political energy should be directed right now instead of on the Supreme Court?
I think progressives can and should walk and chew gum. I don't think these things have to come at the expense of another, but I do think it would be a mistake to overlook the appellate courts and the lower courts. The Supreme Court hears something like 60 to 80 cases in a given year. The Court of Appeals heard something like 50,000 cases last year. So most cases will be finally resolved in the Court of Appeals. And it's very important that we make those courts also democratic and accessible to everyone. Currently, those courts are not representative of the legal profession. They're not representative of the American people. There have only been, I believe, 8 Black women who have served as Court of Appeals judges. President Biden's last batch of nominees almost increased the number of Black women who have ever served as Court of Appeals judges by 150%. Something like fewer than 3% of district court judges or maybe Court of Appeals judges, or 8% have served as public defenders. Fewer than 2% have served as civil rights lawyers. I mean, these are backgrounds in the legal profession that we need represented on the federal courts, because your professional background and your personal background informs how you view the law. And there's been empirical research about how people who have represented corporate interests and represented the government in prosecutions are more likely to rule for employers rather than employees, or they're more likely to sentence criminal defendants to more time. And so it's for these reasons that we need to make the lower federal courts actually representative of the people, not to mention the increasing caseloads and the fact that cases have increased in the federal courts over the last 30 years, and yet the number of judges have not.
Let me say, if I may, that the fact of the matter is that we ought to be pushing for Supreme Court reform, because that's the only way it's going to happen over time. We ought to be looking at expanding the lower courts. It is a bipartisan issue. But right now we have a crisis. And the crisis is that 30% of the circuit courts are Trump courts. 25% of the district courts. There is an imperative to work, all of us, to get those judges that Biden is nominating confirmed. Many of there are judges going on senior status, some that were appointed by Clinton and Obama, and that will serve us well in getting the numbers up. The right has been single-minded through the Federalist Society to pack the courts. Okay, they've done it. It's not okay, but it's happened. We have to fight back. And if progressives don't, it's at our peril.
I close to that point by saying, if people who care about our democracy don't, it is at our peril. I saw someone comment in the chat saying he doesn't want democratic courts. This is about, again, this is not a partisan power grab. This is, if you want people to be treated equally under the law, if you want people to be able to exercise the right to vote. My God, has Georgia not clarified the stakes for people? I think it has, based on the conversations I've been having. And so I'm really committed to making sure that this is described accurately as something that is essential to having a democracy moving forward, given the hostility that people on the Supreme Court, a majority now, including a majority that is more conservative than the one that decided Shelby in 2013, actually cares about these sort of bedrock principles that, again, many of us had just taken for granted. I hope it doesn't take something truly, truly terrible in a decision coming down from the Supreme Court, whether this term or next term, to get people to wake up. But my prediction is that there will be legislation already introduced by the time that happens, so that we can continue to rally around it.
So Bill has added a comment asking, we've had 9 justices for seemingly forever. Would it be wiser to pursue adding judgeships at the appellate and trial court levels? Wouldn't that likely gain more traction? So this kind of gets at what we said before. Do you think there's a risk to trying to walk and chew gum by pushing for all reforms versus perhaps a more pragmatic approach when you see flickers of bipartisan support for it? Do you see the argument for doing that, even if you don't agree with it?
No, because shame on Congress if we can't introduce multiple bills at the same time. And I am really heartened to see a number of my Judiciary Committee colleagues on the other side of the political aisle talk about the need to expand the lower courts. As Professor Littman mentioned, since about 1990, we've seen a 38% uptick in the district court caseloads, and I think appellate filings have increased by 40% since 1990, the last time we expanded the lower courts. As a more recent clerk myself in the Southern District of New York, I know how overworked those judges are. And of course, additionally, in addition, beyond the practicality of just needing more people to adjudicate cases so that we can deliver justice in this country and resolve controversies, we have the opportunity to have a judiciary that reflects the lived experiences of what the speaker calls the beautiful diversity of the United States of America. And I think lived experiences and bringing and leveraging those so that people understand how the law actually operates in people's lives or doesn't operate is critical to doing one's job better on the bench. And of course, we can also talk about, advocate, and advance the cause of Supreme Court expansion, which continues to be, I think, a necessity. We don't have the luxury of waiting when it comes to this. In fact, I would submit that we've waited way too long.
And I will also say that, Congressman Jones is vice chair of the court subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee, and Chairman Hank Johnson, they already held a hearing about lower court expansion in February. So this is definitely something that's on the radar and continuing to move. And I think one of the questions is not only like whether it's going to happen, but to what scope is it going to happen? I think, Jen, you mentioned that the administrative office of the courts, sort of headed by John Roberts, has asked for 79 new judgeships to be created. I think that's a good start, but like that has to be the baseline. When you do look, as Congressman Jones said, and Lea has said, like caseloads have exploded over the last 30 years. And what John Roberts is proposing here with these 79 courts, new judgeships, is only a fraction of what's really necessary. During the Carter administration, Congress expanded the courts by a third. That actually is keeping in line with the increase in caseload since 1990, with the increase in population since 1990. I think we need a much bigger, more robust expansion of the lower courts to really get to this administration of justice. If you don't have your court case heard for years, that has a big impact not only on criminal justice, but also on civil justice. And I think that these are conversations that absolutely have to be happening at the same time as the one we're having right now on Supreme Court reform.
And there has been, as you said, Jen, bipartisan support for expanding the courts. Todd Young, Republican Indiana, introduced a bill in the 116th to add 65. It isn't enough, but there is bipartisan support, and even Darrell Issa introduced a bill. So I think that we can pursue all 3 points, Supreme Court, lower court, and get these judges, Biden judges, confirmed so that we can get rid of the Trump stain on the judiciary.
I think it's also useful to think about how different types of reforms relate to lower court reform, just like we were talking about voting rights potentially relates to Supreme Court reform. So for example, HR 1 and SB 1, the bill that Congressman Jones has been talking about, and we've also been talking about, would make partisan gerrymandering claims potentially cognizable in federal court. So that would create an entirely new set of claims that people would be litigating in the federal courts. If you want those claims to be adjudicated in a timely manner, we're going to need some new judges to hear claims, given that courts are already overwhelmed. Similarly, we're thinking about maybe abolishing or modifying qualified immunity, or giving people a cause of action to sue federal officers who violate your constitutional rights. Those are, again, going to be new and different claims that we're going to need more federal judges to be on hand to actually adjudicate. Or you can think about this in terms of, the criminal justice crisis that's created by coronavirus, where you have people languishing in jail, waiting for bail, being exposed to the risk of coronavirus because the federal courts are simply too overwhelmed to actually adjudicate their cases and address their motions for compassionate release or resentencing. That's not a sustainable state of affairs, and that's not what we should be accepting in our current system.
If we pass the FAIR Act, which would end forced arbitration agreements in this country, you are going to see the proliferation of litigation. And that is a good thing, because we should not have forced arbitration agreements in this country. And so that too is just another example of why we need to increase the number of lower court judges.
So here's a question from Steve. Well, here's what he says. In our lobbying and activism, not to mention talking to friends and family, how do we get past the widespread view that this is just a cynical political ploy to pack the court for partisan purposes and will only lead to packing or unpacking when Republicans are back in control? Do you have any thoughts on this? Any of you?
If we pass Senate Bill 1, the For the People Act, we will allow people to vote in this country. And that means that the GOP will be out of business nationally and you won't see Republican majorities. And so I don't anticipate that when that happens, you'll see Republicans do the same thing because they won't have the opportunity to do so. I'm thinking about the fact that John Paul Stevens and others were appointed by Republican presidents, and they were independent minded and they were pro-democracy and they ruled in reasonable ways. And so this isn't just about, Democrats getting their judges and Republicans getting their judges. This is just about making sure that people who are not partisan hacks, in the way that Brett Kavanaugh revealed himself to be in a Senate confirmation hearing, railing against Hillary Clinton, are appointed to the highest court in the land. And the fact that the American public doesn't have faith in the Supreme Court because of its retrograde rulings is also untenable for our democracy.
I agree. Like, I think that what we're trying to do here it's not a partisan power grab as much as trying to restore balance to the court to ensure fair elections and to ensure voting rights. And look, I think, Congressman Jones is perhaps right on the politics of what happens if these voting rights are restored and sort of everybody who'd like to vote and is eligible to vote can. But I think even the broader question that I think came up in the Q&A about like what happens next and like aren't we sort of on the road to a 200-member Supreme Court? I think two things. One, I think we're sort of living in the worst case scenario right now, where we have a Supreme Court that is so out of balance, that's so tilted toward partisan interests and corporate interests that we have to do something to restore balance. But here too, like I actually think that if you're able to expand the Supreme Court and add in term limits, then you sort of have a longer term, potentially depolitization of the Supreme Court vacancy fights, right? If every single president was able to nominate and have confirmed 2 Supreme Court justices in his or her term, then you don't need to add seats to the next, when you take control, you just need to win the next presidential election. You'll be able to change the makeup and it would be more representative of where the country is as a whole. And so I think sort of over time you can add stability, but it all starts with adding 4 seats. Again, like the idea of term limits, I think, and there's bipartisan academic, consensus, but there's a lot of bipartisan support for the idea that you can have term limits for Supreme Court justices, have justices move on to senior status. That's going to be determined, though, by the Supreme Court. And I think this 6-3 partisan Supreme Court is not likely to rule in any way that would diminish its own power. So you have to, again, add 4 seats to enhance our democracy. And then we can sort of determine whether or not other reforms, such as term limits, might be possible.
So somebody is asking something that I've wondered about, which is how can term limits for Supreme Court justices be reconciled with Article 3 life tenure? Can Congress impose a seniority classification, or is it up to the court itself, or how?
So the text of the Constitution says that federal judges will serve for good behavior. What that means is, federal judges can't be removed at will, but it doesn't necessarily mean they get to serve for life. And there's actually considerable historical support that what this means is they get to serve for the term of their appointment, and that term of their appointment could be decided by Congress before their appointment actually begins. So you could still, consistent with the text of the Constitution, have federal judges serving for good behavior during the term for which they're actually appointed if Congress passed a statute or there was a constitutional amendment defining the term of a Supreme Court appointment for 18 years. That is, like during those 18 years, they would still serve for good behavior. So it's just that we call that language in colloquial terms life tenure, but that's not actually what the Constitution says.
Okay. I have a question for you, Nancy. You've worked on issues like this through a number of Congresses and different administrations. What have you learned from working on this over the years? And what do you say to the reality that even Biden himself has said he's not a fan of court packing, and how you work with an administration when this is what the commander in chief is saying.
Again, let me say, and you probably heard this actually come through. I started life as a field organizer. So that's where I basically come from. Things don't happen. Things don't, change doesn't happen unless there is a grassroots push for it. And that's why I have said several times that we have to build the will among progressives. And what we saw with Amy Coney Barrett was a bigger outpouring than I have ever seen for any Supreme against any Supreme Court nomination. Kavanaugh was certainly big, but this was massive. And I think we have an opportunity to build on it, to build on the sentiment that was expressed in the fall against Barrett. And I think that progressives have to be hounding the White House and senators and letting them know that these are important issues, court reform. And in terms of what we know about the filibuster, that's where we are now. But with a mass movement, I truly believe that we can actually get it done. And I've worked on many issues, and I will tell you, unless there is a push from the field, from the constituents, it doesn't happen. I don't know if that fully answers your question. I can talk about several administrations, but I hope that answers your question.
So let's talk about the time frame here. We're going to have a Democrat-controlled government for 2 years at a minimum, and I feel like you have to operate within that mindset if you're trying to push something through, because the Senate could flip or the House could flip in 2022. So do you guys think 2 years is enough time to make a big push on these issues and expect to get something done? Or do you think that it's worth the push, even if it's an uphill battle and 2 years is simply not enough time to build enough grassroots energy to actually push all of these things at once?
I think there is a unique opportunity for the paradox of the closed Congress. The House and Senate are unfortunately looking very, very much alike in terms of the close margins. Pelosi, I think it's 212 to 219. That's very, very close. And obviously it's 50-50 in the Senate. So this is a unique opportunity to pressure those two members and others to understand the importance of the courts, what's at stake, and why we need court reform. It's going to be tough. My working on civil rights bills, and I have worked on many, leading a lot of lobbying efforts. It rarely happens in one Congress. But if you don't do it, if you don't start, and if you don't start from a positive viewpoint, as I think Chris said, it doesn't get done. So it's tough, but not unprecedented.
Okay, here's another question from an attendee. Do you think term limits will become politicized because then the Supreme Court is constantly an election issue? Is this a concern that any of you have thought about or discussed with other progressives when you've thought about pushing for term limits at the Supreme Court?
So it's something that, I've thought about, but I think you can also think about making Supreme Court appointments more political as also a way of making them more democratic. That is, you actually want the people to have a say about which presidents are selecting Supreme Court justices, rather than leaving it up to fate, like when a justice decides to retire or if they happen to get ill. So yes, it might be more political in the sense that we're actually having public conversations about whether we want a future president to appoint a Supreme Court justice, but that's also another way of letting the people decide and letting the people have a conversation and a say into who they actually want selecting Supreme Court justices.
And I think that these Supreme Court vacancies, are already political. They're already part of the presidential election. It is widely regarded as one of the reasons that Donald Trump won in 2016, because he ran on the Supreme Court and the ability to fill these seats. But I will also say, as we look at the broader conversation and sort of where we are as a progressive movement, Joe Biden won voters who said the Supreme Court was a very important or an important issue to them in deciding their vote. So this whole conversation and the sort of grassroots mobilization and movement around the courts is already moving in a progressive direction, which is why I think that, you say we have 2 years, sort of like a year and change at this point, like time is ticking, but I do think this is enough time. And I think this is enough time. I think the Supreme Court is going to continue to hand down sort of anti-democratic, anti-civil rights, anti-human rights opinions here that's going to unfortunately add fuel to this debate and about the need to expand the court. So I absolutely think that we have enough time here to get something done.
Anyone else? 2 years works?
It's what you have. You take
it is what you have. Okay.
The time period has been defined for us, in fact.
Yes, true. Okay. Here's another question from a very frustrated sounding Michael. This longtime progressive lawyer thinks this discussion is a waste of time. The filibuster, which should be eliminated, won't be eliminated this term. Can you focus on other changes that are more possible? So what do you say to the Michaels of the world who would like these changes to happen, but is really focused on that filibuster problem?
So does Michael only want us to talk about things that can be done through reconciliation? I would be concerned if that was the conclusion, but it seems like the logical conclusion of that argument. Look, we have to make sure that we are pressing people who are on the fence about the filibuster or who need more encouragement to get to where they need to be so that we can have a democracy, so that we can secure voting rights for everybody in this country, so that we can save the planet from climate catastrophe. We face overlapping crises. I don't want to get on the stump, but it would be an abdication of my role not to be pushing for things that would require at least reforming the filibuster. And I think it would be an abdication of anyone of good conscience to all of a sudden stop doing that because we've just reached the conclusion that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are just never going to do the right thing on this issue. That's not how progress is obtained. That's not how legislating works. It's not how governing works. And I would just encourage my friend Michael to keep the faith.
And I would encourage Michael. I totally agree with the congressman, but I would encourage Michael to help get in the fray, help with confirming these judges. That's what join the progressive bandwagon and help on all three fronts. But if you're discouraged and you feel like you can't help on the Supreme Court or on the lower courts, at least get more Biden judges on the court.
I would just add, sorry.
Go ahead.
I would just add that it's a little bit strange to me to have these abstract questions about whether we want the filibuster or not. Like, to me, that issue is just so deeply connected with what you want to get done. And so in order to think about whether it's worth modifying the filibuster, we have to think about, well, what is the possible legislation that we might want to enact, and is it possible to get that through with the filibuster? And if not, right, then that is the reason to potentially modify the filibuster. And, you asked us whether 2 years is enough time. If it's enough time, it's going to be because we are putting in the work and spending the energy convincing people that these are things that are worth fighting for, and saying, if you care about voting rights, well, in order to protect voting rights, you need to think about the courts. If you care about criminal justice reform, that too will involve doing something about the courts. And so I think part of what we are trying to do is doing the organizing and doing the kind of convincing that is part of movement building. And that's kind of what this, or at least how I tell myself what I am doing is worth the time.
Okay, here's a question I have had. I have, and somebody else also threw this out there. What do you make of the idea of proposing term limits to federal judges other than for the justices on the Supreme Court? There's so many federal judges out there that just don't get attention. It's usually in the news. It's usually the Supreme Court that is very flashy and gets the headlines, but there are hundreds and hundreds of federal judges. And if you look at President Trump's record of judicial nominations, there's objectively some people on the federal bench from his appointment process that should not be there. And that's a whole other conversation to talk about removing judges, because that is extremely unlikely and rare. But have any of you in your conversations with progressive activists or academics thought about a serious push on the idea of term limits on all the other federal judges, like all the other federal court seats? I personally have not heard much about that. And that seems like it should be part of a conversation.
So that is, or Chris, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think it sort of depends on the problem that you're trying to solve, right? And I think that that's one of the reasons why it comes up in the Supreme Court context so much, is because justices can time their retirements, and there's only 9 of them, right? They can time their retirements to be replaced by somebody who has the same ideological view, or try to time their retirements. And I think that sort of they're serving much longer than what's intended. And so I think that that's why the conversation makes more sense to be centered around the Supreme Court. I think there's some people talking about it on the lower courts as well, but I don't think the problem is the same. And so that's why I think that the attention and the focus isn't quite there. And I think the bigger problem in the lower courts is the lack of judges. And that's why we're talking about expanding the lower courts to improve the administration of justice and to have more judges that sort of that reflect the diversity of our country and the diversity of the legal profession.
Anyone else? Make the case for lower court judges not being there forever? Okay. So here's a question that I have. And as a reporter who reports on the courts and judicial nominations, I really want to make it interesting to people. And it is not a sexy subject on its own right, I'm sorry to say, but I'm constantly thinking of ways to make the courts and judicial nominees interesting and important. And there was a long time ago, I want to say it was Dan Rather who went on Dave Letterman like decades ago. And Dave Letterman asked him what his one piece of advice would be to journalists, aspiring journalists, from the expert. And Dan Rather said something like, the goal of a journalist is to take something that's important and make it interesting. It's not to take something interesting and make it important. And I think about that when I cover judicial nominations, because it is very important, but it's not as flashy as many other subjects. So my question for you guys who, you all work in various fields connected to the courts and the way our courts function, how do you approach the subject in terms of making people care about what our courts are doing and why they're important and why they should get involved? Because it's not something that people are readily going to be excited about or understand necessarily. And yet there are things happening all the time that are disenfranchising people or that are not fair about the system. And people, I feel, are pretty disconnected from what's going on with the court. So do you have like a rule of thumb that you guys use to make people pay attention to this stuff? And I'm not just talking about court reform. I'm talking about the judicial branch of government. It's a whole third branch and it's important. So how do you guys what is your philosophy on taking this very important thing and making it interesting?
What we've tried to do is to take different court decisions and the damage that they are doing to progressives, to make them understand the importance of the court. I still think there is an opportunity now that we really haven't had before because of Trump's taking over the court, and it's going to become more and more apparent as time goes on. So that is certainly one thing. And I think that we have to keep building on what happened this fall in terms of the outrageousness of Barrett's nomination.
Think about the things that animate that there are entire national groups devoted to, right? Like saving the planet, a woman's right to choose, LGBTQ rights, but particularly the right not to be discriminated against, racial justice and other civil rights championed by organizations like the NAACP. All of those things are in peril if we don't have expansion of the Supreme Court of the United States. And so the connection is not difficult to make. In fact, it is intuitive. And I think we need to do, and I say we generally, just a better job of messaging that to people. Because again, it should not take, the Supreme Court overturning or Begafell or Roe v. Wade, or, to get people to finally understand what this court now has the votes to do. We should be rallying support around court expansion well before then. I just fear that we can't do it quickly enough. So that's why we have to introduce this legislation and make sure that we are all speaking out in favor of it and not fighting with ourselves over, something we know to be necessary.
But Congressman, imagine I am a disaffected voter. I am sitting at my house watching The Simpsons, drinking beer. Someone wants to talk about the courts, and I'm like, whatever. But I'm actually going to be hurt by things going on in the courts. What do you say to me to get me to sit up and say, whoa, like I didn't know that. Like, how do you get that connection to go? What do you just say to someone in a regular conversation? Or do you not actually talk about this for fun?
I do talk about it for fun. And in fact, it is my job now. Look, I would ask you about your life. Why are you disaffected? You're disaffected because government has failed you, or you feel as though government has failed you. And so you are likely to produce any number of reasons for feeling that way, directly related to policies that are now in danger by a rogue, hyper-partisan conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Maybe your boss screwed you over. Maybe you're not able to unionize. And so you have a Supreme Court that would stand in the way potentially of the PRO Act, which we just passed in the House and need to pass in the Senate. Maybe you want to get married, but the Supreme Court has either overturned marriage equality or is imminently going to do so. Maybe you have children and you want to see them have a livable future, but you're not going to secure that for them in the absence of a Supreme Court that would uphold climate legislation and EPA regulations. But that requires having conversations with people and not talking above them, so to speak. And we need to do more of that as a Democratic Party.
Chris, Lea, Nancy, do you have elevator conversations that you can quickly get people to pay attention to the courts about? Or a pitch or something that you do?
I can't do it as eloquently as Congressman Jones just did, but because I do think it is that. It's about meeting people where they are. I think one of the challenges is that people think like, oh, the courts are such a lofty institution. Like, I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand it, right? And it's but people don't have that same sense. Like, I'm not a doctor, so I don't care about the Affordable Care Act, or I'm not like an accountant, so I don't care about tax cuts. Like, but there's something about the courts that seems sort of out of touch and out of reach. And I think part of this is
it sounds boring. It's just
about,
like
that's right. So it's about
boring.
figuring out like what is it that people care about, and every single issue that somebody cares about that does motivate them is going to be decided by the courts at the end of the day. And we spent a lot of time here talking about the filibuster, and I actually think that that's a useful parallel in a different regard. You know, when we talked about, we faced a lot of obstruction during the Obama administration by Republican filibusters, but trying to explain to people what a filibuster was or why you needed 60 votes in the Senate or why you couldn't get things done was almost impossible. But we're now here at this moment where we can say we're too far from getting rid of the filibuster, but we've come a long way, right? We're only in April here. Republicans haven't actually filibustered something yet, and we're getting there, right? Like this, the people who care about change, they care about climate change, gun violence prevention, economic justice, police reform. They understand that filibuster reform is going to be necessary to enact that change. They're also now starting to understand that the courts are going to be necessary to uphold that change at the end of the day. And I think it's that same kind of activism, same kind of educating, where we're not saying you need to care about the courts. We're asking people, what do you care about? And let me explain to you why the courts are important to that issue that's really going to help bring them around.
And I honestly think that we have not played sufficiently against the bad decisions that have come down. I don't think that broadly enough have we talked about choice, voting rights, healthcare. Healthcare does get people upset, and choice gets is high on progressives, and climate change is something that cuts across. That is much more of a bipartisan issue now, not with leaders, but with the some of the evangelicals and Republicans. So I think we haven't done as good a job as we should have in highlighting cases. And as I said, we have the opportunity now, unfortunately, because of Trump and McConnell's and the Federalist Society's successful effort in packing the courts.
Okay, we have another question in here. And this, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but this is like things that you guys can address. How about agreeing to split the Ninth Circuit in exchange for lower court expansion? I'm a progressive, but the Ninth Circuit is a horror show in terms of size. And I know I think that Republicans have proposed doing this because the Ninth Circuit is considered a liberal bastion. Do you guys think that if you're trying to look for ways to build bipartisan support on, say, expanding the lower courts, do you think that kind of trade-off is worth it to break apart the Ninth Circuit, which I know some Republicans really want?
Yes, if that's
Yes.
what it would take to increase the number of lower court judges, by the hundreds, then absolutely, it's worth breaking up the Ninth Circuit. One of the main obstacles to breaking up the Ninth Circuit, which currently covers, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, is just that it's administratively difficult because California is in the center and it's also the biggest. But if that's the biggest obstacle to breaking up the Ninth Circuit, and if that is truly the only obstacle to getting bipartisan support and a filibuster-proof majority to expanding the Court of Appeals, then by all means, it's worth it. Now, I'm not totally convinced that if you agree to break up the Ninth Circuit, you're going to get past the 60-vote threshold in the Senate or bipartisan support in the House. But indulging the hypothetical, yes, that would be a very worthwhile bargain.
Isn't this something that I seem to remember former Senator Jeff Flake had a bill regularly, maybe even John McCain had a bill to do
Yes.
to break apart that court. Is that not, you guys probably know more about this than me, but I don't remember that being proposed in exchange for something else. Is that something that you guys know of that Democrats have thought about or been open to doing in the past?
It has not come up in the court subcommittee as something that would be a precondition for lower court expansion.
Can you talk a little bit about some ideas that may have come up for things that could be trade-offs or however you want to call it, trade-offs, bargaining chips, things that would bring some Republicans over into this camp of wanting to expand the lower courts? Are there things that you've seen or talked about with Republicans, or that any of you have heard, from Republicans that they would be willing to do, that Democrats would also be willing to do in order to move the whole thing forward?
Well, there's not been the introduction of a lower court expansion bill. in the House, and where Democrats do have the majority. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here and talk about trade-offs where none, as of now, need to be made.
Well, I suppose, I mean, prior to this year, I mean, just this has been an ongoing issue for a while, at least with the Ninth Circuit. Maybe Nancy, you've probably watched this one for a while. Is that, I feel like I've seen bills for years to break up the Ninth Circuit, and they're typically from Republican senators. So I'm not sure. They just seem to go nowhere. So is that something that is a viable, in your opinion, something that's an idea for ways to actually move forward with a bipartisan broader bill?
I don't really think so. Let me say that the Republicans have been introducing bills like that, particularly when there is a Republican president. And I remember when Bush was president, and I don't know if Chris remembers this, that they tried to push, and it was constructed so unfairly. It wasn't, let's expand and here is the trade-off. It was very one-sided, and allowing Bush to appoint all those judges. Rightfully, progressives and Democrats opposed it. So while I say it's a bipartisan issue, it would have to be worked out, especially now that we have a Democratic president.
Okay, I will ask one last question because we're almost out of time. Anonymous attendee says that he or she listened carefully and was unpersuaded by Representative Mondaire's optimism about Senators Manchin and Sinema. I want this panel to be more specific about what pressure can be put on them to get with the program on the filibuster and therefore court reform. Facts matter, we don't need spin. So I suppose my question, I will build from that and just say, Congressman and the rest of you, do you think that there needs to be a kind of a co-occurring push on filibuster reform at the same time as pushing for these court reforms? Or do you guys feel like that's a separate track, and while it's related, that's not really the goal of people pushing for court reform?
Well, okay, I suppose I'll start. We need to be pushing to repeal the filibuster, and at a minimum, we should be reforming it such that it is not an obstacle to the legislation that the Democratic majority in the House has already passed. The Equality Act, universal background checks, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, you name it. And that is not something that is going to happen overnight. It is not something that is going to happen absent pressure from the public, including from the anonymous author of that comment. And so we have to make sure that we are mobilizing. My understanding is that there are some folks who are feeling the pressure with respect to their vote on to not overturn the ruling of the parliamentarian in the Senate on the question of the $15 minimum wage. We have to keep the pressure on, and we have to make sure that people know how popular these policies are. And of course, we have to make sure that folks who still need to be persuaded understand that there will be no good faith engagement by this Republican Party, not the party of Donald Trump, on any number of the questions that matter, the questions of great import to our society, including democracy itself, when it comes to the For the People Act. So let's keep the pressure on. I do think that's a separate discussion from whether we need to expand the size of the Supreme Court, and we can do both things at the same time. I say that as a member who has staff devoted to any number of issues.
In terms of the filibuster, I believe that if the Republicans show and continue to show in the Senate the same kind of intransigence that they showed on the COVID bill or on the latest 1.9 trillion COVID bill, and on voting rights and on these issues, I think that there will be possibly a greater willingness to streamline it, change it. What I'm hearing Manchin saying, and this is my interpretation, and I've worked with the senator quite a bit, is he doesn't want to do it. It's bad. He wants bipartisanship. But I honestly think that if they are as egregious as I think they will be, I mean, Mitch McConnell, when Obama became president, the first thing he said is, we will make sure he doesn't succeed. That was his first speech on the floor. He is acting like that now. And if it's the same kind of obstruction, I believe in the next 2 years, even Manchin will be amenable to some kind of change. We'll see.
And I will also just say broadly, I think there's a lot of attention sort of understandably put on Senators Sinema and Manchin. The best way to put pressure on them is to get the other 48 senators lined up first, right? Like, we got to put in the hard work. We got to put in, the work to go from no bill to a bill that passes the House, a one in the Senate, and it's going to take a lot of work. And so, for folks out there looking for like what the next step is, I will very self-servingly recommend that you go to demandjustice.org. We're going to have an organizing call on Saturday the 17th at 3 p.m. I know Congressman Jones is smiling because he's going to be there. Ed Markey's going to be there. Black Lives Matter, Sunrise Movement, Indivisible are going to be there. We're going to start putting in the work. We're going to start putting in the work to go member to member, senator to senator, building this movement. And when we have a movement, when we have a majority of the House, when we have 48 senators in the Senate, then let's start coming up with a strategy to get Senator Sinema and Manchin on board. But that's the way it's going to work. Person by person, neighbor to neighbor, call to call to your member, to your senator, and getting it done. And so that's sort of, I encourage people, demandjustice.org. It's a link to sign up and join us 3 p.m. Eastern on Saturday the 17th.
Okay, guys, we are out of time. I didn't get to ask my last question, which I will throw out now. What is the case to make that court reform is part of infrastructure? Go.
Bridge to the future.
You could win on this one at this point. Okay, so we are out of time. I'm going to hand the virtual microphone back to Russ. Thank you for this wonderful panel. Back to you, Russ.
Hello, that was a wonderful conversation. I want to congratulate you. It was lively, comprehensive, I thought inspiring in a number of ways. I've been there, Nancy, as you know, and seen how difficult it is to do things. But I love Chris's discussion about solidifying your base of support and then, worry about the others later. When John McCain and I did McCain-Feingold, it took 8 years. It was just two guys. And then it grew. And so, we're a 501c3. We don't take sides on this. We're not Democrat, we're not Republican, but that doesn't mean I can't listen to people being very creative and exciting in their thinking. So thank you. And Jen, thank you for a wonderful job of moderating this.